I'm going to tell you all something that I don't think I mentioned that often. In fact, I'm not even sure if I've mentioned it in any videos. I love the Metal Gear franchise. It's such a fantastic franchise, and a fantastic franchise usually has passionate fans, and well, it's the holiday season, so like any good YouTuber, your buddy and pal FuseFall has to do some holiday special, because it's YouTube tradition. So, why not do something Metal Gear related? My 20-hour long essay on the snow and Metal Gear Solid and everything about it? Nah, I don't think the world's ready for that yet. Well, how about Merry Gear Solid? Sure, why not? It'll do. Merry Gear Solid is a 2006 fan game developed by Insignificant Studios, based on the Metal Gear franchise. It takes mechanics from the 2D Metal Gear games and also the Metal Gear Solid games. The game starts off with Solid Santa being guided by Major Tiny Tim on the codec frequency of 012.25, also known as 1225, which is a cute little joke because, well, Christmas. Also, the setting of the game is Hideo Drive, which is a nice nod to Hideo Kojima. Anyway, Tiny Tim tells you how, due to 9/11, years ago, you will now have to walk around the house stealthily instead of flying around. Yep, 9/11 is a big plot point in this Christmas game. After that, you learn the first mechanic of the game, hugging walls to see far ahead. Not much to say about this mechanic, it certainly works. The game introduced this, and let's get good with it before introducing the next mechanic, which is just really good design in my opinion. It's smart to let your player get familiar with the mechanics of the game instead of just throwing them at them in a rapid-fire style that won't stick. The next mechanic is hitting the wall to create a noise that will be investigated, and once again this mechanic works and there isn't much to say besides that. It's hard to screw up something that simple. The next mechanic is Christmas Spirit, where you can move the mouse cursor to turn on televisions to briefly distract the children. I like this mechanic even if it doesn't end up doing much because the mechanics later in the game, for the brief moments that you need to use it, it's easy to use and makes sense instantly. Whenever I saw a TV, I instantly thought, okay cool, time to use the Christmas Spirit mechanic. Though I guess that's also my problem with the game. It feels like every section has a certain way it needs to be solved, and that way is super obvious. Sure, there's maybe one or two secret ways to do it, but you don't get anything from doing it the different way. You don't get to feel smart or clever. I wish the game allowed for a little more creativity with the solutions to get around stuff. The way it currently is just means you never have to think that often. The game can feel kind of mindless at times because of this, like I just press buttons and that's it. There's no tension or no creative thinking to be done here. Moving on, we get the gift box, and this is a fun mechanic and what I'd say is the most useful. It doesn't feel as situational as something such as Christmas Spirit. There's a variety of times you'll have to use it, isn't just, oh hey I see an object so we'll use this here. You have to do a little bit of thinking, even if it isn't much thinking still. After the gift box, we meet Santa's little helper who provides a bit of humor, which reminds me, speaking of humor, the dialogue is this game's best aspect by far. Throughout the game it makes little jokes relating to Christmas and Santa and I enjoy it. Since this is a Metal Gear fan game, it also contains neat little references like Solid Santa being a parody of Solid Snake, and the game over screen having to yell like the ones from the Metal Gear Solid series.
Snake, are you okay? Snake? Snake!
Santa Claus! Santa Claus!
Back to the gameplay though, we get the Seas candy cane, which is nice. It allows you to see the infrared beams since there's no point in trying to guess where they are instead of just switching to the item really quick. I like how the candy cane functions, and I'd say it's a decent addition to the game, even if the candy cane suffers from being an item that essentially does have one purpose, and that purpose being extremely situational. We also get the camera to flash enemies, and right after the Nerf gun, which is just a little Nerf gun and puts enemies to sleep. These are both fun mechanics I often use together. I'd throw down the camera if there's a large group of enemies, then I'd take out the remaining ones with the Nerf gun. And that's all for the mechanics in this game. The game has a decent set of mechanics for a tiny fan game, especially one that came out before 2010, and I think had the game been fleshed out a bit more, it could work. The game does a good job introducing each mechanic, but due to the game being extremely short and beatable within a sitting, they only get time to introduce each mechanic and let you learn it, before moving on to the next one. There's no times where you really bring it all together. I think this game is okay as it is, but had it been made longer, it would have had more time to play with its mechanics, and I think that would make it a way better game. Outside the gameplay, you have the graphics, which are decent. They very much have that pre-2010s fan game look, where it doesn't look professional quality like some fan games now. Instead, it feels like a fun fan project that a bunch of buds did together. Same goes for the music. It's just one Christmas instrumental of what I think is supposed to be Sleigh Ride to my knowledge. God be real, I don't constantly listen to Christmas music. The one remaining aspect of this game is the story, which thankfully gets really weird. I'll give you a couple of seconds to click off to avoid spoilers if you want. But I personally don't think you'll really care about spoilers for a 2006 fan game. 3, 2, 1. Okay, spoiler time. Santa's little helper, Solid Snake, who is here to assassinate Big Boss's twin brother, Big Beard. Santa was part of a project with two brothers, Nick and Jack, and Santa is Nick. Santa agrees to be killed, but turns out that Santa was not Big Beard. Hoops! Can't believe that we didn't check even more before assassinating a target. Well, that's the story. It's pretty weird, but I think it fits this game pretty well because this is a weird little fan game. I like the story personally. So that was Metal Gear Solid. Not a bad game overall, but definitely use a sequel to iron out its flaws. That's exactly what we got. Let's take a look at Metal Gear Solid 2, Ghosts of Christmas Past. I'll be referring to it as Metal Gear Solid 2 because that's easier and shorter to pronounce. The game starts off with an opening codec with Otacon and Cold Snake. Turns out the amount of pretty naughty children groups has grown since you assassinated Santa in the previous games. So on Christmas Eve, you play as Cold Snake as he infiltrates Outer Savin Mall. The introduction sequence here is definitely more in depth as far as plot goes, instead of just mentioning that you're doing this because, oh hey, 9/11. Getting into the game, I can actually see now. I didn't bring this up when mentioning the first game because I saw it as an irrelevant point, but the original resolution and screen size was really small. With Metal Gear Solid 2, I can stretch it to fit my entire monitor. So instead of having to blow up the footage and editing to make it easier for all of you to see, I can have it displayed in the size that is more appealing to look at. Not a big deal, but it is a nice addition. After that, I noticed that the sprite work here is so much more detailed and consistent. It feels considerably less amateur compared to the first game, where there was inconsistencies in artwork. A lot of talent must have gone into the work for Metal Gear Solid 2, because sprites here are much more expressive, especially in the codec scenes, where they've gone from blurry messes that look okay, to sprites that have some detail to them while keeping a clean art style. The world around you is also given so much more life with these detailed sprites. Instead of bare floors, you have floors with nothing on them and floors with snow on them. This seems kind of basic and like it shouldn't be a big deal, but going from the first game's lack of detail to something that feels like an actual world, I figured it was worth bringing up because this is kind of noteworthy. Another big thing I want to bring up is the music here. Music still isn't like this great masterpiece of audio, but it's now so much more passable and fits the mood. It's a lot more tense and sets the stage as this epic mission, while in the first Metal Gear Solid, it was just one song looping to the point of annoyance at times. Speaking of audio, the voice acting here. The voice acting is very much still a amateur fan project, and I think it's self-aware of that at least. It doesn't try to be AAA voice acting. Moving on to the gameplay. The gameplay is way more refined and improved. Sort of. Let's start the positives first and work our way down to the negatives. There's now a radar on the top right of the screen that displays a sight of enemies. This is really useful because in the previous games I was never 100% sure where an enemy could see me and where they couldn't, so sometimes I had to guess. And while it never became an issue due to the first game being focused more on smaller and tighter areas, the design of the sequel opens things up a bit more, making the radar a smart addition that if it wasn't there I probably would have a problem with it not existing. The radar also displays your current objective, which is also extremely useful. In Metal Gear Solid 1, you often were just trying to exit the room and climb to the top of the house. There weren't many layers to the story and it was kind of basic get to the end and that's it. Which is fine, but Metal Gear Solid 2 goes for a different approach and it's no longer entering a room and never coming back. Sometimes you'll enter a room using that room, and go back through the room you just came through. Is this revolutionary design? Not particularly, but it makes for a massive increase in depth overall compared to Metal Gear Solid 1, now that the world's more interconnected in a sense. Well, that's sort of it for positives. Time to get into the negatives. You know how I complimented the radar for being useful? Well, I do stand by that still, but the radar is in a weird position on screen. The radar isn't exactly in the top right, so it's just in this position where you essentially have a massive blind spot where you know there's something there because the radar says there is, but you can't actually see what's there. Also, the radar could have been smaller in my opinion. In a stealth game, I don't want to have a massive blind spot, and having a big old radar there forces me to have one. Sure, the radar is useful, but does it really need to be that big? Probably not. You could afford to make it a little bit smaller and throw it all the way in the top right. That would just make it a little bit cleaner looking and give you less of a blind spot. Speaking of the UI, the entire UI, while detailed and shows you important information, is also cluttered. It has a bunch of stuff displayed in the bottom left and it's weirdly shaped and I don't get why it isn't just spread on the bottom of the screen. Sure, that would take up more space, but the difference is that it would be in an area you barely need to see, and the text is small enough where, unlike the radar, it would not take up a ton of space. Another major problem with the text is that it's yellow and hard to read unless I stop and look at it. I shouldn't need to stop and decipher the text for the UI. It should have been an easier to read color. The point of UI isn't to make you stop and have to think about, hey, how do I read this? You should just be able to look at it. Besides the regular UI you'll see all the time, there's the inventory system. Metal Gear Solid 1's inventory for holding items is basic and crude, but it functions. Metal Gear Solid 2's inventory system looks better, but also kind of worse to use in my opinion. Metal Gear Solid 1, I would press shift and be able to quickly switch items. With Metal Gear Solid 2, I have to press Z, which is an extremely awkward key press to make, then I have to hold that awkward key press while in the inventory. It leads to switching items being a pain and a chore because of this change. While the old inventory system wasn't perfect either due to how bare bones and crude it looked, I'd rather something that is more comfortable to press and open than something that looks flashier. But all of these complaints pale in comparison compared to my biggest problem with Metal Gear Solid 2, the dialogue. Metal Gear Solid 1's dialogue usually didn't drag on too much, instead mostly relies on just making a quick joke or two. Metal Gear Solid 2 tries to go way more in on the humor, and while it sometimes works, for example, the cane that puts people to sleep is called Novocaine, but in most cases I just found myself constantly getting bored as the jokes dragged on. You know what, here's two of the unfunniest jokes from what I played. First, here's one when you find a deer mask.
Otacon, I found a reindeer mask.
Snake, is there something you have, to tell me?
Aren't you usually the one to tell me how new items work?
Well, it's just, I want you to know that furdom has been around for a long time, and...
Furdom?
Yeah, you know, furries. It's a fandom that revolves around anthropomorphic animals.
Anime. It's always anime with you, isn't it, Otacon? I'm a mercenary. I don't have time for any nerd hobbies. Now tell me how I can use this thing.
The joke's punchline just does not work at all in my opinion. It's trying to make a joke because, oh hey, a deer mask, but it just keeps going on. The joke would probably work if it was just Otacon asking Snake if he has something to tell him, and then Snake is confused and the joke ends there. But it keeps going and it doesn't work. The next joke is even blander in my opinion.
Except what?
Well, have you tried looking on the back of the Blu-ray case? I know, it's a pain, but you need to find the Blu-ray case for Metal Gear Solid 2. You see the Blu-ray case labeled Metal Gear Solid 2?
No.
Huh? Oh, wait, we're on the PC, and the game is downloaded onto your hard drive. There is no Blu-ray Metal Gear Solid 2 case.
Otacon, get a grip.
What an age we live in, huh, Snake? Digital distribution. Wonder what they'll think of next.
The joke is supposed to be a fourth wall break, but the only break it does is break my soul because of how boring it is. It's funny at first because, oh, check the manual, but then it runs into the same problem as the previous joke. It just keeps going. It doesn't know when to end. Metal Gear Solid's fourth wall breaks are usually pretty fun and in my opinion, don't overstay their welcome because they know when to end. But the jokes in Metal Gear Solid 2 just do not know when to end. It just keeps going. Actually, speaking of overstaying their welcome, the entire game's dialogue does. Feels like I barely get to enjoy the solid mechanics of the game because every time I do something, a codec happens right after and I'm just left wondering why I'm still playing at this point. Every time a codec was incoming, I just sat back in my chair and fell into what felt like endless boredom until I could go back to playing. The game is fun when it chooses to be, but it usually chooses to not be fun. Eventually I got to the first boss fight and by this point I gave up. The unfunny jokes and constant interruptions just made me feel like it wasn't worth playing anymore. I think this game has potential, but so many problems hold it back for me where I don't see it worth beating. It's technically better than the original at least. If you can stomach the lame humor, and if you don't think the other issues I mentioned will bother you too much, you have a decent time on your hands. I consider both Metal Gear Solid games worth your time. Speaking of time, that's all the time I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, happy holidays, I'll see you guys next year. I'm Fuse, signing out. See ya.